he, at the time in 1917, in February, he was a third-year student at Petersburg University in chemistry. His work was interrupted by the revolution. He often said that he did less with research than breaking up fights in bars, and he often talked about the excitement he had. He was in some sort of militia. The excitement he had greeting the revolution. Even after he had done a lot of other things, including doing the basic work in photosynthesis in 3 volumes that was published in Russia under Stalin, and working on the atomic bomb, and then founding the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and helping found the Pugwash conferences on international policy, etc. He still counted among his greatest, probably among his greatest achievement was being the first to count up the votes for the Constituent Assembly in his district in St. Petersburg. He was so proud of that. He talked about it a lot. So Victor and I were born in London on the eve of the war. My family was a victim. My dad, Eugene, was lucky enough to get a job in the United States at MIT. So I grew up in my earliest years were in Watertown, Massachusetts, outside Boston, while he was at MIT during in 43, 44. We were in Chicago. We were always, pardon? Okay. Well, she does this all the time. Well, okay. So anyway, the key is that for my entire life, I've been surrounded by Russian immigrants. This happened from London on through Boston, Chicago, and Illinois. That's where my Odyssey started.
Can you repeat the part where you and Vic were born in that hospital? So, Alex was born into Russian studies in Oregon, and I discovered Russian studies through Indiana University. And it was all a question of, and this is an interpretive question, and I'll frame it as follows. In May 1989, for reasons I don't understand fully to this day, the Gorbachev government asked me to speak on Red Square on May 1 about Nikolai Bukharin, because Gorbachev was using Bukharin to get back to Lenin without Stalin, and my biography of Bukharin had just been published in Moscow. So this was a surreal experience. I didn't want to do it, but the Bukharin, surviving Bukharin family, with them, so you must do it, you must do it. You have to do it for Nikolai Ivanovich, for Bukharin. So, I mean, there I am, going to speak on Red Square on May Day, televised the whole country, and they said I had 3 minutes. I did it. And then we met up with the Bukharin family afterward and marveled at this phenomenon of how a kid who grew up in Kentucky ended up standing on Red Square on May Day talking to the Soviet nation about Bukharin. And it happened, I think, sort of like this. I was in Indiana taking I couldn't do science, and somebody said you should do political geography, it counts as science. And there was a very nice professor by the name of Norman Pounds, who I later learned was a world-famous geographer. And he noticed me and he said, "You're a bright boy, have you ever been anyplace?" And I said, "Yeah, I've been to Cincinnati. I grew up in Kentucky, just down the road." He said, "No, I mean like another country." And I said, "Well, no." And he said, "Well, you're going to go to my university, Birmingham in England. I'm going to arrange it." So I had nothing to do with myself, literally. I had no purpose in life. I wanted to be a professional golfer, but that illusion had ended. So I go to Birmingham, and I'm walking around the working class district because I wanted to buy a car to take home, and I see a sign that you can go to the Soviet Union 5 cities for what was the equivalent of $400. Now I had saved $400 to go to Pamplona to watch the Bulls run, because that's what boys who read Hemingway in those days did. But being raised in a loose Jewish culture, I thought 30 days in the Soviet Union in 5 cities for $400 as opposed to 3 days in Spain, I think I'll go to Russia. And for no reason or another that I got on a Russian ship in London, and I went to Russia. This was the summer of '59. And I didn't understand anything I saw, except one thing, that this was a country awakening from a great terror. Remember, Stalin had died in '53. And people were so eager to talk to a person they perceived to be an American, not about anything political. You know, did I have a car? Did I have my own apartment? Did I have a refrigerator? What is this called? That I became fascinated by the country. And I didn't even know there was Russian studies in Bloomington. So when I come back from Birmingham, I discover that there's Russian studies and there's Robert C. Tucker, who was, in my judgment, the greatest Russianist of his generation, and maybe the greatest Russianist America ever produced. That's a separate conversation. But I was very lucky. And Alex studied with Bob, too. And Bob said, well, if you're in Russia, you've got to learn the Russian language. Then I want to get a PhD. I go on to Columbia. And that's how I got interested in Russia. Had I not come to Indiana, again, I grew up 3-hour drive down the road in Kentucky, I probably would not have met Norman Pounds, Professor Pounds, who said, you seem bright, have you ever been anywhere? And that led me to a 5-city tour a year later of Russia. And enough of an interest, not intellectual, I think it was not intellectual, it was, what was the word? I don't know. But, so to flash forward, and I'll end that with this, when I was asked by the Gorbachev government to speak on Red Square, and I did, reluctantly, and then we went to the Bukharin household, and we all marveled that not only was this American speaking on Red Square, but Gorbachev had used me to complete his rehabilitation of Bukharin by working Bukharin into the May Day celebration. It was all contrived, political, and I didn't mind being used. I mean, I understood what was going on. We went to the apartment and we had a discussion about the story I just told you. And it was a typical American-Russian discussion. I said it was all sluchinist. That's what it was. Just, you know, a typical American kid with no idea what he wanted to do, but enough curiosity that if somebody said, that'll be interesting over there, why don't you go over there? I went over there. And that led me to Red Square. And what did the Bukharin family say? Who knows what they denied this. Who knows what they said?
Fate.
Yeah. All of them, no. Tini Provsti. Это был твоя судьба. So, how I came to Russian studies, you have 2 interpretations. It was all accident that ran along the Ohio River and then up here to Bloomington, or it was fate. I always thought it was the accident part, but as I've gotten much older and thought about it, I'm open to the possibility that it was Sudba.
Sudba.
I can say for sure that my entry into Russian studies was not an accident.
Sudba wins the day.
Well, there are births that were not intended.
Oh.
Yeah, I can say that my parents wanted kids.
I know they wanted Vic, but were they planning on
I can't talk to I can't ask her.
Are you getting ready to go on the road with the show?
We're going on the road. This is vaudeville.
This is the show. I think, first of all, thank you, IU, for organizing this extraordinarily moving experience, this event. Steve, in some ways, already answered this, but Alex, what brought you to IU, and what impact did IU have on your scholarly trajectory?
I went to Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. There was no Russian history there, but I had, through my years with immigrants, I had become interested in Russian politics and culture. Summers in Vermont, we still have a place in Vermont. We just came back from our place in Vermont. There was the summer home of Michael Karpovich, whose name may be familiar to many of the people here. He had been in the Russian legation in Washington in October 1917. He had stayed, he taught at Harvard, he had become the most prominent trainer of Russian specialists, of a generation of the most important historians and actually also political science. Anyway, Nabokov was at the Karpovich's frequently. I used to try to fool people by suggesting I hunted for butterflies with him. I actually chased after him as he hunted butterflies. I was not old enough to know, but Kerensky was a regular, the last prime minister of the provisional government in Russia in 1917. But I had gotten a worldview from them that was completely anti-Soviet, anti-communist. As I grew up, it was during the Cold War. I went to Knox during the McCarthy hearings. I can remember sitting around in a bar and watching the proceedings. I had subsequently served 2 years in the Army, during which I taught soldiers to hate Russia. To hate everything about communism and communist Russia. And so I had this mixed bag, and then I got to the University of Chicago for my MA, and I worked with Leopold Heemsen, whose name may be familiar to many of you, but he was instrumental in training a lot of key historians interested in the background to the 1917 revolution. That was my first entry into Russian history. I was captivated by it, but he left to go to Columbia after I got out of the Army. I had finished my MA work, I didn't leave the Army with enough money to go anywhere, and so I got a scholarship offer from Indiana and nowhere else, and that's how I came to come to Indiana. I had never regretted it, as you may guess, since I came in 1964, and with a slight pause of 2 or 3 years when I taught at USC, and long periods when I did research and was in the Soviet Union. I've spent the rest of my life in Bloomington and Indiana University. Just to finish up, Janet is getting antsy here. Indiana was a wonderful place then. It had just, so I arrived in 1962 with my young bride, but we were very happy here. Steve was here at the time, but it was an exciting place. There were terrific library holdings already. There was a very, very strong history department of politics. Politics and history were really the center of the Institute. And, but there was also one thing I should mention, which is to some extent no longer true. Students in political science, there wasn't much difference between students in political science and students in history. We hung out together. I don't want to go into too much detail, but in any case, political science students took history, and history students took political science courses. We all took Bob Tucker's course. Václav Beneš, who from the Beneš family, Czechoslovakia, was here, and a very, very strong history department, and a Russian and East European Institute with Bob Burns, who had come out of intelligence as chair of REI. Anyway, it was a very exciting place to be. It didn't have the breadth of REI today, but at the same time it had perhaps it had great strength in politics and history, which made our lives terrific here.
Steve, do you want to?
Well, Alex is right, it was one subject then, as I think it still should be, the study of politics and history. And I can make this argument at great length, but universities, for budgetary reasons, not entirely intellectual reasons, have compartmentalized themselves bureaucratically, partly having to do with budgetary funds. Those disciplines have gone their own way. And Alex is right, when we were here studying together, I never thought of Bob Tucker as a political scientist, though political themes were. He worked as a historian, he thought as a historian. He actually got his PhD at Harvard in philosophy. I mean, I don't know how many of you know Bob Tucker, but this was a very, very, very great scholar. And his first book had nothing to do with Russia. It was a reinterpretation of Marx, which presented Marx as a Hegelian. That later became the predominant interpretation of Hegel, and still is today. Though I noticed from reading the TLS that Bob is no longer given credit as having been the pioneer, because so many generations have passed that he's been semi-forgotten. But Alex is right. I came here, it was an exciting place. But why I came to Indiana was my usual kind of, the truth is I had middling high school grades. I had a notion I should go to Colgate. I don't know where I was. I finished my last year in high school down in Florida, not in Kentucky. There really wasn't any kind of, what do they call them now, college advisors? There were any. My grades were sort of middle-aged, but my uncles, who were lawyers in Evansville, none of them had sons. Back in those days, women didn't become lawyers very often. So they were counting on their nephew to go to Indiana Law School, like they had all done, and become a lawyer and join the firm in Evansville. I mean, that was what they thought, it was on the map. But the reason I came here is that I still wanted to be a professional golfer. And I actually got a tiny, weeny golf scholarship. I was half decent. And I got here, had a meeting following out with a coach, quit the golf. But that was what brought me to Indiana originally, plus the fact it wasn't all that far from home. I came here to play golf, oddly enough, and never did. I really put aside that ambition. There were a couple intervening events where I got massacred by a guy who went on to lead the PGA in money earnings and substance. Frankie Beard, how many of you remember him? I don't know. Frank Beard was a great golfer from Kentucky, where he creamed me in Paducah, and that was the end of that. But I came here, and it was Bob Tucker. I went to him, as I said, I made this junior year sort of trip to Russia. He said, you got to study, and he took me under his wing. And I was just lucky, really. I think it's probably safe to say that had I not come under the influence of Tucker, who was not a mentoring man, he wanted schools, he wanted people to follow the Tucker school, but through his writings. He really wasn't much on mentoring graduate students. I think we were sort of a distraction in a way. We TA'd this stuff. But that's where I met Alex, and there were a group of us, and it was a very good group. It's amazing. Some have passed. Bob Charlotte died just recently. But an astonishing number of us who studied with Bob went on to become professors. Fred Floron, Eric Kaufman, all at what we would call provincial universities around the country. But out of this group of the early 60s, mid-60s, at Indiana, I could make an argument became the single most influential group of graduate students subsequently as professors around the country of any generation in the university. And a lot of it had to do with Robert C. Tucker. But I didn't calculate. I came here to play golf.
If I might interject, at Columbia, the Indiana group was known as the Indiana Mafia. And I should also add that, if I'm not mistaken, memory might not serve me, but you switched from golf to pool.
That's good.
He could often be found, there was a pool hall above Nick's, and he could often be found there.
Well, this is, I guess, a good segue, and Steve has partly answered our next question, which is, were there special people, episodes, or experiences connected with Russia that had a strong influence on your lives? So
Let me go real quickly on that, because I'll never forget this. Tucker was giving a lecture course on called Soviet politics or something. He later moved it to Princeton, by the way, and then I went to Princeton too, and I was his junior colleague then, assistant professor at Princeton. He was teaching the same course at Princeton he had taught here, and then he gave it to me. He wanted to teach about Marx, now he didn't teach about Russia anymore. So I took it over, but there was a kind of direct line between his teaching in Bloomington and he wasn't interested enough to institutionalize it. What I institutionalized is a study of in Soviet politics, and it was really politics and history at Princeton. What happened, I remember this vividly, that in the middle, this would have been in November, if I'm right, 1961, Bob Tucker's lecture course happened at the 22nd Congress of the Soviet Communist Party. Now, people don't know, I would guess, in this room what happened. But you know in '56, Khrushchev gave a so-called secret speech about Stalin's crimes. We now know it wasn't secret at all. That document was read at every work collective, every school, every administrative office across the Soviet Union in 1956. The whole country knew about it, but it wasn't published. But in November, I guess it was, 1961, at the 22nd Party Congress, Khrushchev gave a much more damning account of Stalin's crimes, and he did it on national television and radio from the Congress. Bob was teaching his course at that time, and Bob got so excited because Bob's relationship with Stalin was, to say the least, intense. He had already committed to writing a biography of Stalin, and he really hated Stalin. But not hated him in a way that distorted his work, but, you know, Bob had lived in Russia during the war. Many of his friends had been arrested, some never came back. Members of Jamie and his wife's family hadn't survived. But Bob abandoned his entire lecture schedule of the courses. And since I was assistant, I knew, and just did nothing but a daily, I think the course was 3 times a week annotation of what was going on in Moscow at the 22nd. So the Party Congress, so the course was transformed to a course about sort of Soviet politics and history into a daily interpretation of the 22nd Party Congress. And most students couldn't understand what was going on, but I was riveted by what Bob was talking about, because he knew all this. He had lived in Stalin's Russia, and he was so excited that it was being told to the whole nation now. And it came back to me when I was reading a memoir by Solzhenitsyn, who was at his dacha in November 1962, 61. And he was listening to Khrushchev on the radio, and he couldn't believe it. And in the memoirs, it's worth reading, he says that something I thought would never be widely written to or said to Russians is now being told from the highest podium of the political system by the leader of the country, and I'm sitting in my dacha listening to it on the radio. So I remember that event, the 22nd Party Congress, and it brought home to me what was the unity of politics and history. That would be my commitment. I just add one anecdote to this. So I went to Bob Tucker, and I said, Professor Tucker, I think I want to become a scholar like you, Russia, but I don't actually have a theme. I was going to begin with a master's thesis. He said, well, what are you interested in apart from Russia, intellectually or politically? And I said, well, you know, I read or was taught that during the American Civil War, the president of the Union and of the Confederacy were both Kentuckians, Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. And I said it always interested me that you would have presidents of opposing sides in the Civil War from the same state. He said, so do you know what that means? And I said, no. He said, that means that in Kentucky, there were alternative roads of development. And that should be your subject, alternative roads of development in Russia, Soviet Russia. And I said, well, that haven't been adequately studied. I said, well, what has not been adequately studied? And he said, the Bukharin alternative. And so it is really true that my Russia, I went to Russia, I pursued Russia through what began here in Bloomington. 100%. After that, I was sort of on my own, and Bob didn't always approve of what I was doing. but we remained close until he was the best man at our
Well, he was at the
wedding.
best man, I think, at both your weddings.
He was the best man. He was not the best man at both of my weddings. That is not legal. He was not the best man at both.
Alternatives.
So Alex, what about special people, episodes, experience that were formative for you?
Well, I've already mentioned Hainson, so I'll turn to somebody else. Well, Bob Burns, in the sense that he built the institute up to that time, but he really didn't read much. It didn't influence me in particular, and in fact, he admitted to Jack Thompson, my mentor, that he had, while he was on my committee, he hadn't read it, my dissertation. Many years later, Jack told me that was the case. But Jack Thompson, I would mention. I had become interested in Russian history. I had done a thesis at the University of Chicago on Gorky's visit to America, and but which hadn't been studied much up to then. I had gotten from Boris Nikolaevsky, who was a regular at our place in Vermont, the leading Menshevik, the archivist of the Social Democratic Movement. He was kind of an uncle to me. I should have mentioned him earlier, but in any case, when I came to Indiana, I gravitated towards Jack Thompson, and he had an immense impact on me in the sense that he gave a free rein to students to do whatever they wanted within reason. And I had become interested in the revolution. Irakli Tsereteli, does that name mean anything to anybody here? He was a leading Georgian Menshevik who had been really the de facto leader of the Petrograd Soviet and the Central Executive Committee of the Soviets in 1917. I had met him in Vermont. We had interacted. I decided I wanted to do a biography of him. I started on it in Jack's seminar. It quickly became clear that that working on Tsereteli without knowing Georgian was useless and hopeless. And so there were frequent guests here at the time, and that was one of the things that made Indiana, I think, special and interesting. Just as today, with Steve, actually, there's a constant flow of important and really useful people to interact with. One such person was Philip Mosley. Does that name mean anything to you? Anyway, Phil Mosley was here for a lecture. I had lunch with him. I told him my problem with Tsereteli. He said, why don't you work on Tsereteli in 1917? So I explored that, and as I was exploring that, I had still come to Indiana with this anti-Soviet, anti-communist bent, loud, and clear, and strong. But as I started working in the sources that were available then, even from these limited body of sources, I could see that the revolution was much more than Tsereteli had felt it was. It was a genuine revolution. It hadn't been explored. There was interesting things to be said about it and to be found about it. And Jack gave free rein for this kind of exploratory work, and so I'm forever grateful to him. I modeled my own seminars for years after his. He had a 2-semester seminar during which students developed their ideas for master's or PhD theses. I did the same, and so I'll end there. Jack Thompson, definitely.
So both of you have spent much time in the Soviet Union and Russia over the past 6 decades. How has your deep acquaintance with the country and people affected your scholarship, teaching, and views in Russia? And how have your views changed, if they have, about the country over time?
I'm going first? Oh, that's fine. I first went to the Soviet Union with Janet shortly after, not long after we were married, and just after the Secret Speech in '63, '64, academic year. It was, the country was still in ferment from the great sort of foundational speech of Khrushchev's, and so it was exciting to go to classes, to go to department meetings where subjects relating to Soviet history that had never been discussed were being discussed. But I should say this, we both felt very much to our surprise, we both felt comfortable in the Soviet Union. I remember the first night I was in the dorm at in Corpus Jet and Ngo, a little cubicle of a room, and but we settled in for the night, and there was, as there usually is in hallways in Ngo, then there was a lot of talking in the hallway in Russian, and I felt at home because it was the voices I had heard all my life. And I think in general, we warmed up to Russians as people. Incidentally, there were in the dorm, there were Chinese, there were British, there were French, there was a whole UN. And Russians and Americans felt, I think, most comfortable together than with any other group, and that has stayed with me. And the idea that despite the government, Russians are Russians, and it's terribly important that contacts, personal contacts are terribly important, so when I was dean for international programs for many years here, I thought overseas study was tremendously valuable and important for the rest of my end. Janet and I have been going to the Soviet Union and Russia regularly. For many years when Janet was with the press, I would go by myself, often for 5 or 6 months. And that's been a terribly important part of my thinking. Now, some of my dearest colleagues, and actually since the late '60s, since the '70s, maybe slightly post-Brezhnev, a little later, are some of my dearest friends and closest colleagues. I should stop there.
The first time I lived for a prolonged period in the Soviet Union was 1976. And I then, until they stopped issuing a visa to me, an entry visa, and then when they perceived that Katrina and I were together, they wouldn't give her one either. It was 82, they stopped giving the visas. And just to jump to the end of the story, 10 days after Gorbachev came to power, we got a call that we should apply for visas. But until that moment, I spent a lot of time in Moscow from 1976 to 1982, by hook and crook. Sometimes on my own, sometimes manipulating the exchange program. Once they wouldn't let Katrina go because she wasn't my wife, Jana, but I looked up the original treaty in Russian, and it said Suprug Supruga. Didn't say anything about Jana and Yush. So I said, Ana Maya Supruga. And they said, okay. So we went. Intellectually, it was, I wouldn't say a complete, but a profound transformation in my thinking. Because remember, I was researching as a historian, but teaching as a political scientist. It was a profound transformation in my thinking about contemporary Russia, and particularly about the theme that interested me most, change. How change happens in Russia. This was partly framed in my mind by the fact that I grew up in a completely segregated society, Jim Crow society down in Kentucky. And I'd always been interested about how Jim Crow got changed. And I had told Tucker that, and that was another thing. He said, there you go, alternatives and change. So I'm living in Russia, and I fall into three semi-concentric circles. The circle around Roy Medvedev. You all remember Roy, the dissident Russian historian, Marxist historian. A woman by the name of Tanya Bayeva, who you all know, because she lived, her father was a big mocker. He was vice president of the Academy of Science, I think. I was living in the Academy of Science building, she was living there. Tanya was basically, she was at the very center of the dissident. Anybody in trouble came to Tanya's house. Anybody who wanted to stash Samizdat manuscripts, anybody who wanted to get things out of the country or into the country went to Tanya. So when I met Tanya in this building, I got drawn into these circles. And I was drawn into the circles of the survivors of the Gulag and the old Bolsheviks through this Bukharin surviving way. And then through that Roy Medvedev, who was at the center of sort of dissident historians. But what this did was, because they took me into their parts of society, we think of society primitively as a pyramid. I mean, I was studying up here at the top leadership, right, biography and that stuff. But as I was living in Russia, I was moving down the pyramid. And what I discovered was the complexity of the Holocaust. None of the stereotypes, none of the grays, everything, to use a metaphor that I think Alex Yanov, remember him, first used. Americans see Russia portrayed as gray. Russia's multicolored. Never mind the censorship, never mind the outward conformity, but the society, and that didn't begin to capture what I encountered. I mean, I won't say I was flabbergasted, but I was enthralled by the diversity of it all. And out of this began to form in my mind how change might happen. And what I discovered, because I met people that were in the sort of lower or middle levels of the nomenclature, and people who were dissidents, is they were all talking about reform and the opposition of conservatives. So conservatives in society and conservatives in the nomenclature. So that led me to write this article, and I will applaud myself because somebody else did, called Friends and Foes of Change. Reformers and conservatives in the Soviet Union, that people would later say foresaw Gorbachev, predicted Gorbachev. And in fact, there were a bunch of articles when it was published in the Soviet Union under Gorbachev, still, you know, Cohen predvido perestroika. But this isn't true. I did connect the dots. I saw that all through Russia, from the nomenclature to society, there was, Gorbachev was right, what was the word he used to use? A yearning for change, or whatever it was. It was there. And it just needed to be summoned. What I didn't foresee, what was my mistake, is I was still thinking in the old Khrushchev model of liberalization, not democratization. I didn't foresee that all these things I saw living in Russia from 1976 on could produce a leadership that would actively pursue democratization, which Gorbachev did no matter what anybody says. We can debate when he got it in his mind and when he became committed, but he did commit to it when he was in power. I didn't foresee that. I was still thinking of an expanded version of a new Khrushchev thought. Less censorship, you know, more historical discussion, but not democratization. But living in Russia during these years, alone and then with Katrina, that's what pointed me. And so when I wrote that article in the late 70s, and then revised it in the early 80s, that people thought was prescient, to the extent that it was, it came directly out of living in Russia during those years.
What do we think?
5 o'clock, do we want to?
Should we do one more?
One more.
You choose. Maybe disagreements or?
Well,
Maybe we should ask the
I'd like
wives
the
a
one,
question. What do you think?
how do you think the field of
Russian
Russian-Soviet studies
Yeah.
should develop in the future, and what about Russian-American relations? How about comments about that?
Well, I'll do the first one quickly and the second one not. I mean, I have been, since I began to think about it, and I'm not sure when that was, an advocate of détente. And I talked about this with some students this afternoon. And I can give you all the reasons. I mean, the nuclear dangers, the cost of Cold War. I have been a pro-détente guy since at least 1976, when I was asked to become the youngest member of a board, a lobby headed by Donald Kendall, who ran PepsiCo, that was devoted to the idea of détente, and I remain that today. And I think the situation is every bit as dangerous today. And to the extent that détente means reducing the dangers of Cold War conflict by introducing cooperations, that's my politics. And I could turn it philosophical and go about we've got so much in common. But there's a lot we don't have in common. And that's the reason why détente is all the more important. Briefly, what was the second part of the question?
Well, the first part was, how do you think the future of Soviet-Russian
Yeah, well,
studies should develop?
I just published a book, War with Russia ? And all I can say is that book evolved from radio broadcasts that I began weekly, national radio broadcast every Tuesday night at 9 o'clock. And I began to take notes, and they grew into little notes to myself, and then I looked at them and said, those are little commentaries. So I posted them in the Nation, and then I brought in the book. And what I say there in the preface is that never in my life of studying Russia have I thought that the chance of war with Russia was truly possible. It's probably not right of me to comment on the field. As director of Russian studies at Princeton for many years, I followed in the Tucker pattern, which was that history and politics, that everybody had to know the language, everybody had to be multidisciplinary, and of course in economics about Russia and Soviet Union, though fewer and fewer Soviet economists were available to us. It was getting hard to, and departments didn't want to hire, they had all gone theoretical. But one should have a multidisciplinary and political sociological background. I still feel the same today, but I'm not familiar with some of the, with many of the departments, but the ones that I am familiar with, I don't like the direction that they're taking. They are too public policy oriented. They've been subsumed into so-called schools of international relations in a way that flattens Russia to conform to the discipline of IR, which I have never found a very rich and enthralling discipline, even when I was a kind of affiliated member as a professor at Indiana. I mean, they have some theories, and the rest of it is a study of politics and how people and nations behave. And I never found the theory of IR very interesting. I'm not really, I mean, to be frank, we are in McCarthyism light at the moment. I assure you of this because I live up where people are much more politicized, I think, and much more engaged in this Russiagate stuff and all the rest. And I know for a fact that there are people who are not prepared to say what they think. And these are people who would have some authority if they spoke out. But they don't want the attendant grief. And I get a few letters now and then from young people who ask if they should speak out in the, they agree with me, they say, should they? And I tell them no, not until they and their families are secure. I just tell them that frankly. I mean, nobody's going to arrest them, nobody's going to shoot them, but they will be defamed privately in ways that will inhibit their careers. I know this to be so. I don't know if it's widespread, but I know of enough cases to know that it's out there. And I tell young people to be careful until they've got themselves and their families and their careers secure. Maybe that's bad advice, but that's, at my ripe age, that's the lesson that I have to give. And I don't like what's happening at all. And we can say it's all about Trump and Russiagate, but it was coming on long before. Trump and Russia came. Long before.
Alex, what would you say?
I subscribe to most of what Steve says, and probably not enough time to talk much more than that. I will say this, that REI, when I got here, and I think I sort of mentioned it before, was under Bob Burns, and it was very much know your enemy. And when I became director of the Institute, I tried my very best to depoliticize the Institute, to make it a genuine agency for understanding Russia, in Russian culture, Russian art, Russian music, Russian politics, Russian history. I like to think we were successful. And I believe that is still the case today. Then there was a great emphasis on politics and history. Now there are all sorts of things going on within the Institute that we didn't have then. We didn't have anything in anthropology, relatively little, but some in folklore. There are important facets of Russia, and geographically Siberia, which is an emphasis today, which wasn't an emphasis then. But all to the good, and I think that's terribly important. And then lastly is the question of non-political. Perhaps some of you have heard about the controversy now over at a Program at North Carolina and Duke in
Middle East Studies.
Middle East Studies, where the Department of Education under Betsy DeVos has criticized and threatened to cut off funding unless that program did more by way of looking at Janet, you know more about this than I, but
Well, it's been criticized for being too pro-Arabic and not broadly.
and being actually being criticized for being anti-Semitic. In any case, that is a real fright for all of us. I think it is a little bit about what you were concerned, kind of McCarthy situation. I think it's something that all of us that are interested in REI as a important discipline, and Russia and East European as important disciplines in their own right, and important for the world. And I think it's something we all need to think about, concern ourselves with, and stand up and scream if it comes to that.
So should we'll go to the floor?
Yeah.
Do you want to, Janet, you want to field questions?
Just given what you just said, that the political influence on all of these different disciplines, I mean, I've studied political science, so I guess it should be assumed that it's going to be a part of the curriculum. But I find that in even just basic, like my French class, like utter politics has like just come within. I mean, what do you think that various disciplines that are not political can do to avoid such issues like that?
Do you want to take it?
I'm sorry, my mind drifted because I was thinking of a question I was asked before. Is it for one for you or me?
Well, either or. You were just mentioning how the politics.
How to keep politics out.
Right. I don't know how, but I find it hard. Is it really a serious problem here, say in Russian or in sociology? What, I mean, I should ask. I should turn to the faculty here who who teach and ask if it's a problem. I retired in 1999, so I can't add much. Certainly, if it's a problem, I wasn't aware there was.
Did you?
Yeah, I'm curious, Alex, you mentioned having grown up in an anti-Soviet environment, and Steve in Owensboro. As your careers developed and you took a more liberal perspective, how was that received in the areas where you came from?
So there used to be, help me folks, there was a federal fellowship that we could get, very lucrative, that required signing a loyalty oath. Was it the NDF?
National Defense Education Act.
So they were lucrative fellowships, so we all applied for them, I guess. And I got one. And that you'd never been a communist and you never, or something like this. So it turned out that the FBI was supposed to vet the truth of this, right? I didn't know that. So the FBI agent down in this little town, I didn't even know there was an FBI agent, in Kentucky, played golf with my father every Sunday. So they're planning the foursome. My father tells me this story, and all of a sudden this guy's name, was it Frank or Jay, turns and says, "Marv, Steve's not a commie, is he?" And my father says, "Not so far as I know." And he said, "I didn't think so. Okay, I got to file a report on Steve. I'll just say he's not a commie." That was sort of the level of this. It was everywhere, and it hurt a lot of people. I can name, John Hazard. You all know the name John Hazard? A great figure in American Russian studies, who was a pioneer who lived in Russia in the 1930s, and then basically created the program along with Mosley at Columbia. McCarthy got on his case personally.
Because of Lend-Lease.
I can tell you, the reason was John was deputy director of Lend-Lease. And McCarthy said he was giving stuff to There's a sub-story here. The director of Lend-Lease, Leslie Groves, right? He was at the Manhattan Project with his father.
Yeah, General Groves.
He was head of Lend-Lease. He told John Hazard during the war, we're on the same side of the Soviet Union. You all know this by now, right? And we're shipping them Studebakers and Spam and all this great stuff. He told John Hazard, Leslie Groves, "John, don't sign. I'll sign. One day there may be trouble." Can you imagine that Groves, during the American-Soviet alliance in this Nazi Germany, had the foresight to think one day there might be, I don't know about Groves, but this was some man, that he saw that in 42, 43, so John Hazard never signed. Mark McCarthy could never produce a document with John's signature on it. Did this come up because of the political influences on the field? Look, let's be honest. To say to be non-political, it's not possible. I mean, we're all political. We all have our views. And Russia, probably in our lifetime, has been the most politicized and political of international foreign subjects. So it's ridiculous to pretend that we don't have political thinking about Russia or about what Russia-American relations could be. I mean, I would never say to somebody, "Oh, I study apolitical." I'm not political. I'm intensely political in the sense that I want a détente. Not a friendship, but a partnership between Moscow and Washington for the sake of the world and the sake of the countries. That's a very political aspiration. But I believe that I can be mindful of my politics when I work and write. So when I'm writing advocacy stuff, I say what I just said to you. This is what I can do. When I'm writing what purports to be scholarship, I think I know where to draw the line. I think I do. And I trust other people to do the same. But of course, people who write with a political agenda and don't tell you about it, they're the most transparent people in the world. I mean, you see it right away, right? When you read it or you talk to them about it.
I must say that I don't think I have ever felt any real problem. Nikolaevsky, the Menshevik, was unhappy with my view of the aborted July uprising in July 1917, and that I didn't blame it on Lenin. but I try to base my work so carefully in concrete sources now from years in the archives, and I've been working for longer than I want to mention on my present book, trying to make it sort of critique-proof from a political angle. I was accused by Soviet historians during the Brezhnev era as being a bourgeois falsifier. I took that quite a bit. In a way, I took that as a compliment. Very soon, thanks partly to Steve. Steve's book on Bukharin was published when.
Right, Village, if you mean.
Yeah.
The Village,
Yeah.
Well, the translation was ready by 1987 to be published, but Avelichov, who headed Progress, his doctors for Progress, which was about as high, it was under the direct control of Alexander Yakovlev, who was Gorbachev's man on the Politburo, who handled ideology. And Yakovlev couldn't get it released. The
Till
book
89.
released, so the tirage was available, but it wasn't released until March 1989. But so he was sitting on these books. He had your book on his list early on, but I mean, Yakovlev said, "Don't overload my political system."
Well,
But he was.
Everything was a struggle. And,
There was a question about people who meant something to you. I think Alexander Velichev in Janet's Spirit, he was the chief publisher of Progress, played a major role in publishing your book and Alex's.
That's what I was saying. He had
And that was a
Velichev
major-
showed me the list of what he said. Do you think there ought to be any other books on there? But at the top of his list were Tucker and Rabinowitch. And well, I don't know whether they had the translation ready. I mean, Bukharin's son did the translation of my book, half of it.
They
But
had-
I think it was ready. I met him in 1987
Yeah, he was at one-
Yeah,
when I went with a delegation of American
But
publishers.
you gotta remember, this is an amazing moment. We forget. Most of you, I look around the room, most of you either lived through it or know enough about it. I mean, this struggle at the very top of the Soviet political system, and particularly in 87, 88, and 89, it was intense. I mean, and it got to the point of, would they publish Alexander Rabinowich's book on it? Because it had a whole, it was a different version of the revolution than the one that was orthodox. And would they allow Bukharin to be re-entered as a founding father? And for us, we sit around and debate, well, is this a plausible intellectual argument? For them, this was about the future of the Soviet Union at that moment. It was all, the politics were so politicized. History was so politicized during Perestroika that it was thrilling. I mean, we remember it. I mean, the things that we sat and bored everybody to death with for decades have now divided Russia. They are fighting in the Politburo. I mean, it was unbelievable. Gorbachev says at a Politburo meeting, we're going to publish this biography by this American of Bukharin. Does everybody on the Politburo agree? I got the transcript. Yeltsin says, "Я думаю, слишком рано." Gorbachev ответил, "Нет, Борис Николаевич, слишком поздно." Oh no, уже поздно. So I'm thinking to myself, these guys are sitting in the damn Politburo meeting debating my doctoral dissertation. What the hell has happened to us? And the same thing was going on with book like, and this man Avelichov,
He was very
who
important.
ran this powerful state, his doctors for press, called Progress, had taken it upon himself, with the backing of the Politburo, Alexander Yakovlev, to decide which Western historiography would be introduced into the mainstream under Gorbachev of Soviet historical studies. It was an enormous undertaking. And as those of us who came to know him began to learn, that he was the most calm and phlegmatic of me, wasn't he? I mean,
Well, then you
never
got out.
did the- Then they got him. They got him in the end. His enemies got him. They rigged up financial corruption charges on him. He was innocent, and he left the country. He was in France, Belgium. He was in Belgium. But
For me, it was
a
a
struggle.
very exciting moment. Up to that time, I had been sneaking copies of The Bolsheviks Come to Power in my suitcase maybe 2 or 3 a trip. Norton had published it in just a very small format, and I had it hidden away. And then suddenly, Larina was there, Anna Larina, Buharin's wife, a lot of dissidents. They were all at the presentation of the book at Progress Publishers. And it came out in a tirage of 100,000 copies.
Unbelievable.
Can you
Think about it.
imagine?
Stop and think what he just said. 100,000 copies for
And I
scholarly
was
monograph.
2 or 3 at a time. I mean, it would have taken me forever. Anyway, it was for that reason. It was very exciting.
For those of you who
And it
don't know
sold
Russian,
out.
tirage means print run.
And it sold out. Yours?
They all disappeared.
Yeah, but every once in a while now, when I lecture in the Soviet Union, some old elderly person.
Russia, that's not Russia, when you lecture in Russia.
In Russia, what did I say?
Soviet Union.
Soviet
It's tough,
Oh, I'm
tough
sorry.
to break.
In Russia, forgive me. To all the
The Soviet Union ended?
for all our guests from Russia, I apologize. But anyway, it was such a
Eddie.
heady.
We used to debate, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And since times, I don't think they're gonna come back, but it's not impossible. There's no censorship in Russia at all today that's of any real consequence.
No.
No, there isn't.
Come on.
What's-
State television.
Oh, I'm book censorship I'm talking about, I'm not talking about television.
Every
There's
country
less-
has censorship.
I will just aggravate everybody. There is less censorship on Vremya than there is on MSNBC when it comes to American Russian.
I dissent.
But the point of it is that we used to, I mean, is this a good thing or a bad thing? That books such as we wrote, at that, there was a moment in Russia when not only were they published in tirages, print runs of 100,000, and then a second printing, and debate in the Politburo, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's an exciting thing, but in a way, it's been generated by decades of censorship. So in that sense, it's a bad thing. This is not normal, right? I mean, it's not normal. But we had a good time, right?
Well, and your work influenced generations of scholars, of Russian students who read your books.
You know, I might dissent from that. I've been, you know, a lot of people read my book, but I don't know that they wouldn't have, once the change was sort of taken away, I'm not sure they wouldn't have done a lot of it on their own. They would have access to the same materials. I was impressed last year on the centennial of 1917. There did seem to me, not only in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but from the provinces as well, to be serious, interesting work. I think that's been true, independent work. I think that's been true for several years now. That's my only dissent.
It's important.
Yeah, well, I wasn't saying there wasn't. I was just saying what the impact at that time was.
Well, my
A
wife
lot
is
of
wrong
people-
too. She thinks. that
No,
it's
no,
not-
you know
no,
what,
wait
it's
a
not
minute.
important, they're questions from the floor.
Let's
Start with Regina.
Our disagreements are
She's
not
trying to get
important.
in.
Yeah.
Hi, Regina.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm again picking up on something that you both said, which is about your Indiana Mafia, Flair on Hoffman, Charlotte. What's remarkable about the group of people you named, and Hoffman was my undergraduate teacher, is that they were all revolutionaries in their little fields.
Yeah,
Present company
revisionists,
included.
yeah.
They were people who went after basic ideas and really challenged conventional wisdom. And I wonder if that's attributable in some way to being together, but in Indiana, away from the East Coast corridor, and also maybe under Tucker, and how do we draw those strengths out again today?
Very interesting.
Right, the answer is all of the above you mentioned. My wife reproaches me because she thinks I'm having extreme reactions to things she sees as lesser, but I am really alarmed by what's out there today. and the way people talk privately about scholars or writers on Russia whom they don't like. Leave me aside. I went through about 3 years where, I mean, it was just, I got a carton of clips like this long about the Cohen Putin apologists and stuff like this. But privately, people talk about a lot of people this way. And it's also the case that there's a systematic exclusion from the mainstream television commentary shows of people whose views do not conform to what is now an orthodoxy. And why is that not the question?
The question had to do with being away from like the provincialism and conformity of New York. What created this Indiana mafia? What were the sources? And can one
But I said,
can one replicate
all the factors that Regina mentioned, I think, contributed to it. Being here, Tucker, the group that happened to be here. Also remember that Vietnam War played a big role. I mean, everybody was reviving. The revisionists came to the fore in fields that had nothing to do with Russia. There was revisionist American history. I mean, to be a revisionist historian, it began, I think, by the way, with the history of slavery. I've been reading about this lately. Revisionist histories of slavery and the founding of America and the provenance of slavery. But it spread, and it quickly spread to the question of the 40-year Cold War, where you had these revisionist historians who were saying that we were all taught it was all the Soviet Union's fault. But in fact, both sides contributed, and there was even a school that said it was America's fault. I'm influenced by Tucker, oddly enough. I never studied it, I don't know. But Tucker always felt that given Stalin's personality, which he thought was a crucial event-making consequence, that a Cold War was inevitable because of the way Stalin saw the world. He was not going to let the West anywhere near. He was going to build an Iron Curtain if the West did, because he wanted to keep. It wasn't the Iron Curtain for Stalin, Tucker thought, the metaphorical Iron Curtain, was not to keep Russians in, it was to keep the West out. And he didn't want any Western influences in Russia. And that was Stalin's way of thinking as a statesman, if you want to call him a statesman. And that was a revisionist point of view. Revisionism was in the air, though, but it was driven mainly by Vietnam, in my recollection.
Just, Regina, to respond to your question, I don't think it was uniform in Indiana during that time. For example, I think that there were a number, Herman Wells and Bob Burns had brought in several immigrants. Their viewpoints on and their seminars were very different than Bob Tucker's or than Jack Thompson's. So we had our share. We gave birth to our share of people who thought differently, were very strongly anti-communist. I think it was more individuals, and in that vein, I would say that I think in our training of our graduate students, I know this is true of Steve, and I know it's me, we try to carry on the tradition that Steve got from Tucker and that I got from Jack Thompson. I had 22 PhDs in history, 20th century history. I tried to run my 2-semester seminar, which I talked about, in the way Jack Thompson had, giving free rein, but as much support and help for good students as I possibly could. And I don't think that necessarily was true throughout the university or throughout the Russian Issue Institute.
Yeah, my question touches on something that you mentioned last night and today in your talk, and I think I would address this question to both of you. Chernobyl was certainly a wake-up call for many people in the East and in the West. Certainly the West realized that the Iron Curtain wasn't going to hold a radiation cloud back. I was speaking with someone last night after the talk who'd spent a lot of time with Ukraine, and she really sees 1986 for a lot of Ukrainians as kind of the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, of a real loss of confidence transparency and in admitting the extent of Chernobyl. So my question is, to what degree do you worry, and should we worry, about the stockpiles of nuclear weapons, about about aging Soviet nuclear power plants, about this recent accident, release of radiation that's been detected, about a submarine that's still somewhere in the Baltic as if it's leaking radiation. To what extent should we be worried about this? To what extent do you worry about this? To what extent do everyday people in Russia and former Soviet bloc countries worry about this?
Can I just say a word, and then Steve knows a lot more about it. I just think that we should worry about it everywhere, not just in Russia, but in the United States, in Iran, or wherever. My father, who had worked on the bomb and who had founded co-founder of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, designed the doomsday clock. This struggle to educate mankind about the extreme peril of the atomic age, that's been with me all my life, and Steve has sort of sacrificed his own scholarly life for this same goal of educating the world to the dangers that we face. There's lots of other changes. I don't want to get into that, but climate change, all sorts of things. Steve?
Katrina's, maybe her best friend, Eric Schlosser, has published a book called Command and Control. And it's a documentation of nuclear accidents, mishaps that have happened that were never made public. So and narrowly, yeah, I mean, they didn't blow up the world, but they could have. I assume people understood.
Yeah.
I mean, but we didn't know about it. I mean, we know about some accidents. We know about Chernobyl. We know about others. I can't think, I mean, I don't want to sound smug, but I wasn't surprised by Chernobyl. I thought we'd been walking on the razor's edge with all these reactors and these weapons, these stockpiles. Whether you look at it from their technological vulnerabilities, the fallacies involved in science, or you put in the human factor, the drunken, attendant or whatever, or what can go wrong? What is that? Whose axiom is this? Whatever can go wrong will go wrong. What is that? What's that called?
Murphy's Law.
Murphy's Law. I mean, apply Murphy's Law to all this lethal technology. Why would we have been surprised by China? We might have been horrified that it was waiting to happen. And there are going to be more. And it's easy for us to say, the Russians. But no, it's not. And that's what Eric Schlosser's book tells us, that we're on this razor's edge.